Welcome along to the deep dive. I'm your host. My job, well, it's to take tricky subjects, get some expert help on the source material, and pull out the key stuff for you. Basically, making it easier for you to get up to speed without reading everything yourself.
And I'm here to help unpack it all, connect some dots, give a bit of context. Today we're digging into a really significant moment in South Asian history. Still feels relevant today, actually.
It really does. We are looking at the 2001 Agra Summit, India and Pakistan. Our source material comes from excerpts of a fictional podcast across the borderlines, specifically their look at Day 8 called The Agra Summit, a Handshake that Trembled.
Right.
So our goal for you listening is pretty clear. Let's understand the context, what actually happened, and why this summit ultimately played out the way it did, all based on what this podcast episode tells us.
Yeah, and across the borderlines, the source, it jumps right into it, July 2001. You have to remember, this is just 2 years after the Kargil War, which was, short but very intense. Fought right there in Kashmir. So obviously, relations were pretty frosty, to put it mildly.
So for India to then invite Pakistan's president, General Musharraf, to Agra for talks, well, the source emphasizes that was a huge deal. Controversial, even.
Definitely controversial.
Yeah.
Because Musharraf, as the source makes clear, was seen by many in India as, well, the architect of that Kargil conflict.
Right. The guy behind it.
Exactly. So extending that invitation, that was bold. But then across the borderlines points out he arrives in India and seems to be genuinely talking about peace. It's quite a contrast.
It really is. And the source highlights some of his early moves, doesn't it? Like how he engaged with Indian journalists.
Yeah, and making a point of visiting Mahatma Gandhi's memorial, Raj Ghat. Those were powerful, symbolic gestures, clearly trying to build a bit of goodwill, maybe suggest a desire to move past the recent fighting.
So you can imagine, as the podcast notes, there was hope, but maybe cautious hope, given the history.
Very cautious, I'd say. Decades of mistrust don't just vanish. But there was definitely something in the air.
Okay, so backdrop. A recent war, surprise invite, positive signals, then the summit itself, July 14th to 16th, 2001, and the location the source mentions, the Taj View Hotel in Agra.
With the Taj Mahal itself right there in the background, the podcast calls the setting ironically poetic.
Yeah, I could see that. This huge monument to love overlooking these really, really difficult talks.
Exactly. Talks about Kashmir, obviously, cross-border terrorism,
Yeah.
and CBM's confidence-building measures, trying to build trust.
Standard agenda items, maybe, but the source really flags the different priorities, right?
Absolutely. It emphasizes Pakistan, under Musharraf, wanted Kashmir to be the central issue. Everything else flowed from that.
Whereas India's focus, led by Prime Minister Vajpayee at the time.
India, according to the source, was prioritizing getting assurances on stopping terrorism first, before anything else, really. And that fundamental difference, well, that's often a major hurdle in these talks.
Sounds like it. Walking a tightrope. The source mentions Vajpayee, known for trying to build bridges, was really working on it. But that core disagreement, Kashmir first or terrorism first, seems like the big sticking point.
It does, and yet, and this is interesting, the source says there was a sense of momentum, at least initially. Like what? Well, it mentions draft agreements being worked on, reports of smiles, positive body language between the delegations, and the podcast specifically highlights Musharraf doing this Q&A with Indian editors. Apparently, he might have even swayed some public opinion a bit during his visit.
So it paints a picture of maybe a possible breakthrough, that things were actually moving forward.
For a while, yeah. It seemed tangible. Like maybe, just maybe, this time could be different.
But then the source describes a really sudden shift, doesn't it? On the last day, it all just falls apart.
Completely. Talks collapse. No joint declaration, no agreement signed, nothing concrete to show for it.
Wow. So what does Across the Borderline say went wrong? What caused that sudden breakdown?
The podcast points to India, insisting that any joint statement had to explicitly mention terrorism, cross-border terrorism.
Okay.
And that was apparently a line Musharraf wouldn't or couldn't cross. Pakistan saw that insistence, the source suggests, as India trying to sideline the Kashmir issue.
So that fundamental disagreement, again, framing the problem differently.
Exactly. One side focused on security, the other on the long-standing political dispute. And according to the source, both sides just dug in their heels. The window, that potential opportunity, just slammed shut.
Ooh, Yeah, the source calls it a huge letdown, especially with all the media attention and the hopes that had built up. There's that phrase they use. Even though the handshake was warm, it trembled and it couldn't hold. That really captures it, doesn't it?
It does. It sums up that feeling of something promising just fizzling out.
So, Across the Borderlines then looks at the bigger picture, framing Agra as this major missed opportunity.
Yeah, according to the source, many analysts felt it was the closest India and Pakistan had actually come, certainly in the early 21st century, to finding some kind of real path forward.
And the potential impact, if they had signed something.
The podcast suggests it could have been huge, potentially reshaping, the whole political dynamic of a subcontinent. A really big what if.
The source also flags what made this summit maybe a bit unique, right? Like Vajpayee's known push for peace.
Yeah, his personal commitment was well documented. And also, having a Pakistani leader who was a military man reaching out like this, that was also somewhat unusual. Factors that maybe could have led somewhere else.
But didn't, because the source also highlights the constraints.
Huge constraints.
Yeah.
Internal politics back home for both leaders.
Mm-hmm.
Opposition parties, hardliners.
And just that deep, deep historical mistrust between the two countries.
Exactly. It seems, based on the podcast's account, that neither leader really felt they had the political wiggle room to make the kinds of concessions needed for a breakthrough.
They couldn't sell it back home, perhaps?
That seems to be the implication. The source uses this analogy, Agra being like a love letter written but never sent, all that potential just stuck.
So pulling it all together then, thinking about what Across the Borderlines presented, what are the main takeaways from this deep dive into Agra?
Well, I think the episode really drives home how crucial it is in diplomacy to balance the symbolic stuff like the venue, the gestures, with tackling the actual thorny substantive issues. You need both.
Right. Symbols aren't enough on their own.
Not when the core disagreements are so deep.
And it also just starkly shows how fragile these peace efforts can be. History, mistrust, domestic politics, they weigh incredibly heavily.
Yeah, the source keeps highlighting those contrasts. The hope versus the disappointment, the warm handshake that ultimately trembled because the diplomatic deadlock was just too strong.
But importantly, the podcast doesn't just leave it there as a total failure. It stresses that Agra, despite not getting an agreement, did offer a glimpse of what could be.
Just the fact that they did talk. That these two leaders from countries with such a difficult history sat across from each other, engaged directly, explored possibilities. That itself, the source suggests, had value.
Right. And the podcast's final thought is quite powerful, isn't it? That dialogue, even when it fails in the short term, is never futile.
Exactly. Maybe just unfinished. It leaves you, the listener, thinking about the long game in international relations, that these difficult conversations, maybe they're essential groundwork, even if the payoff isn't immediate, something to keep pondering, for sure.